public comment on industrial siting, and we have some more information from the state agency. So you want to go ahead and give us your update on that?
Can we hold up one,
Please? Oh, you don't have a... Got it? Okay.
You get a little more out of that gavel than I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm Alan Edwards. I'm the administrator of the Industrial Siting Division. I talked to Director Parfit over the lunch hour, and he had a couple of items that he suggested I bring up because they might add a little clarity to some of the previous discussions. Relative to the appropriations, the only thing that is included in the budget request every year is the appropriation for the 1.5 FTEs. You know, there's lots of other input that's provided. Agencies provide input, but our appropriations is based solely for the 1.5. Relative to the impact assistance, as part of the industrial siting application process, there's a determination made on what the projected sales and use tax from any given project would be. And then as he explained it, and I understand it, is then the total amount of what's the council considers for impact assistance is based upon a percentage of that estimated sales and use tax to be derived from that project. So that comes in, of course, you know, what's the total construction cost, what kind of materials, what's subject to the tax. So there are really two different processes, and then the money is distributed from the Department of Revenue. So there is that. And then also there was the question of how we got to right now where the impact assistance is paid through sale and use tax. I said that change was made in the 80s because prior to that, the companies, it was their responsibility to work with local government jurisdictions and work out an agreement and an arrangement of what would be covered and what the costs would be, et cetera. And that process became very onerous in getting final agreements and all of that. And apparently there were some of the companies who had considered Wyoming elected to go somewhere else because the process was onerous and it increased their out-of-pocket costs by paying directly those impact assistance. So his recollection is in the 80s they converted that to make it a simpler process. Now, whether it's still the best, at that point in time, it took that burden off of industry, simplified it for them, with the intent of hopefully making their facilities here more feasible and practical. So he thought those two items might be helpful for background.
Any questions for Alan on those two points? Questions? No questions?
I'll be here through the remainder, so if any more questions come up. Kimber had to be back, so I told her to go, and if I can't answer any future questions, we'll get back to you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. Any public comment on industrial siting in the room? Any comment in the room? We have one comment on the Zoom. Is he available? Let's go ahead and get Mr. Hawkins on the Zoom then.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'll introduce myself a little bit. I'm the chairman of the Albany County Fire District 1 over in Albany County. I'm pretty new to this position. I'm a career firefighter and was a volunteer firefighter since about 2003. So I'm very passionate about what we do and how we do it. But I'm new to this whole process. So thank you for allowing me to be able to sit in today's meeting. It's been extremely informative and I've learned a a great deal about how the ISC works, how it functions, and some of the history to it. So it's been a great experience so far.
Give us your name, please.
Luke Hawkins.
Okay.
I guess from my perspective, having gone through the ISC twice now, both for wind projects for the Albany County Fire District, it's been a frustrating process in terms of what I do know and what I thought I knew. And again, I'm very naive to this position and to this process. It's been very good. But some of the process has really pointed out the disparity between what I believe is reasonable service for these projects and what we can actually provide based on the revenue that we're able to generate. One kind of side note right off the bat, I'd like to make a comment too. I know there was discussion earlier about the voluntary required annual reporting on impact assistance funds. And I was present during that ISC that we discussed that. I'm not opposed to the reporting, but to say that but I do need to mention that it does create a fairly substantial financial impact, especially when we don't really know what that reporting is going to be like. We're a relatively large in geographic size, but small fire district. And we are all volunteer with the exception of one paid secretary on hourly and then one contract bookkeeper. So to then report in excess of what we hope to be about $3 million in impact assistance from the Rock Creek project, it will be a considerable financial impact on our current structure and staffing. Other than that, I would like to just say that, again, it is extremely informative this morning, what I've learned from it. I get frustrated as a board member in a fire district that's all volunteer that we struggle to be able to generate the revenue necessary to be able to perform our duties that we feel responsible to do. And when we're in the understanding of a potential impact assistance through such large industrial projects like these wind projects, and we see what that math equates to as an approximate or proposed ceiling to that impact. And in the last two projects, we've received roughly 50% of those. It is a struggle. I would ask for any questions that this board may have for me.
Any questions for Mr. Hawkins? Any questions? Any questions for Mr. Hawkins? Hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for being with us all day.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any other Zoom? No more Zoom? Anybody else in the room? Yes. Mr. Edwards.
My sincere apologies, Mr. Chairman. Todd had raised a third point that I would be remiss if I didn't raise. I would also pay the price when I returned. There was a lot of discussion about the threshold for a project being jurisdictional. The threshold is defined by statute and also by the price point. And if they meet all of that, then there's payment out of the Department of Revenue from anticipated sales and use tax. He has had at least one experience where a company was clearly non-jurisdictional, but they had requested the department to issue a jurisdictional letter so that the impacts would be paid out of sales and use tax. Todd wanted to have me make the point that jurisdiction is jurisdiction, and we draw that as a very hard line. They either are or they aren't. So cost estimating becomes important, but they have to clear that hurdle to be eligible for the sales and use tax benefit. So threshold,
So they couldn't get the benefit if they didn't meet the thresholds.
if they're non-jurisdictional, then they're non-jurisdictional and they don't qualify for sales and use tax as established under statute, which they had wanted because obviously it would be a good deal for them, but no, they don't meet the threshold and they're not jurisdictional. They don't have the benefit of those additional funds. So,
I think we had that question from
Right.
Representative Gray
right.
about whether they would push that and try to get that revenue.
Right. So, but again, I was remiss and I apologize for not bringing it up when I was last time.
All right. Any questions? Any more questions for Mr. Edwards? Thank you. Thank you again. Any other public comment from the room? No Zoom, no room. Public comment is closed then. We don't have any action to take on that subject at the moment, so we'll move right on to hydrogen. And I believe that's in your book, about middle of the way through there. There's a presentation. The role of hydrogen in Wyoming's energy economy. And I think we have Dr. Morrell. Oh, there he is. Yep, we have him online. So, Dr. Morrell, you want to take it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Glenn Morrell, Executive Director of the Wyoming Energy Authority. I would like to thank you all for inviting me to speak on this important topic. We have a lot to cover today. Thanks for your patience as well. It's been a long 2 days. We have a lot to cover. We're going to cover why hydrogen, why it's such a big deal, in particular in Wyoming itself. Talk real quickly about how to produce it and some of the various methodologies there are to generate hydrogen. I'll present some projections and some numbers. I'll throw out a bunch of some conversion factors that will help you understand what this really means. And we talked about some of these big numbers that get kicked around. I'll talk about the Wyoming Interstate hydrogen hub application that we're working on. I'll talk about the very important topic of water use, and I'll cover some policy considerations to close. So a lot to cover. I know you'll want to hit the road, so if you'll bear with me for the next 3 hours, I'll keep it brief.
We won't be with you for 3 hours, Glenn.
Anyway, back to the point. So slide 2, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. They'll start off with a quick look at the energy strategy for Wyoming. Many of you are very aware of this. I've presented this before. I just want to highlight that hydrogen has been part of this energy strategy right from day one, from the day we first published it. And just to recap on the energy strategy itself, it's really a vision to transform the Wyoming energy economy. Note that I use the word transform, not transition, right? We're not transitioning away from anything to anything. We're transforming the way that we use our abundant resources. And in that context, that's why hydrogen plays such a key role, because it presents an opportunity to do that, to transform the way we do things so that we can still utilize the abundant resources that we have in the state, as well as the infrastructure. And the way that it does that, there are basically 3 reasons why it is such a useful or such a potential in that context. The first one is simply abundance. And hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. And on this planet, we literally have oceans of hydrogen. It just happens to be bonded with oxygen and present in the form of water. Now, there's not a lot of free hydrogen around. It does exist, but it's not really common. And typically it is a part of a different compound in combination with a different element. But it is very, very abundant. The second piece, which is very interesting, is that it's extremely flexible. So there are multiple manners and ways and means to produce hydrogen. You can use multiple different feedstocks: coal, natural gas, municipal waste plastic, biomass. It can all be used as a feedstock. You can access different energy streams to generate it itself. It can be transported in multiple ways. You can pipe it as a gas, or you can liquefy it and pipeline it. You can convert it into a different species. So take it to ammonia or some other hydrogen-based compound. You can move it to a solid and move it as urea, for example. And that flexibility allows you to use pipelines, railroads, interstate. You can put it on tube trucks. That's a tremendous flexibility that is very useful. It's also extremely useful, or it has a lot of utility in terms of the way it can be consumed. It can be used as it's for heat and power in different ways because of the different species that exist, gas, liquid, different compounds, so on. You can utilize it in many different ways. Everything ranging from fuel cells, motor vehicles and fuel cells to utility power and everything in between. It is extremely useful. Then the other piece that makes it most interesting now, why it's seeing such an incredible resurgence of interest, is that it can be produced in a way that is decarbonized, where it comes with a very low or a net zero or potentially even negative carbon intensity. And that is where the great deal of interest exists today, because that has been driven by this change, this macroeconomic trend that we see globally, where the consumers want low emissions energy. And hydrogen checks a lot of boxes in terms of how do we continue to provide energy in a reliable way to consumers in the way that they want it, i.e. with a low carbon intensity. So flipping the page to slide 3, go through some specific examples of how that might relate to Wyoming specifically, okay? So the first one there, co-firing with or converting thermal generation to hydrogen. So that idea is simply you have a lot of a coal fleet and you have a natural gas fleet in the state. If you are able to generate low emissions or net zero hydrogen, you can co-fire those systems. You could have your coal-fired power station burning a mixture of coal and ammonia, for example. And the natural gas side, you could have a natural gas turbine burning natural gas with a certain stream of hydrogen. You could go so far as to actually convert the systems entirely, so they burn only hydrogen or hydrogen compound. And in doing so, the overall emissions profile of those generation systems goes down immediately and drastically. Coal to hydrogen, that's not a new idea at all. The state has some experience looking at coal to hydrogen in the context of coal to liquids and other things, some historic projects dating back 10 years or so. But coal to hydrogen actually kicked off as early as the year 1800. And in fact, in 1790, coal gas and town gas, which is a coal-based gaseous fuel, they were used to light the streetlights and heat homes and things like that. Coal gas is 50% hydrogen. It is basically a hydrogen gas. In those systems, there's also produced gas, which was the industrial equivalent. So hydrogen, in the form of some sort of coal synthesized gas, was the dominant urban and industrial gas for the best part of 150 years, from about 1800 to 1950, when it was displaced by natural gas. Hydrogen, in the form of coal gas and other things, was the dominant gaseous form. So it went by because natural gas displaced it, but it's still an incredible opportunity for a place like Wyoming, where it opens up a sustainability path for our coal resource to continue to be relevant and sustainable in a decarbonized future. Natural gas to hydrogen, kind of a similar story. Our biggest market for natural gas is California. And given their low carbon fuel standards and the potential for that low carbon fuel standard to be adopted or borrowed by other states, we have to be cognizant and aware that our natural gas, our access to that market may be under stress in the future, and hydrogen presents a very useful avenue to preserve that market access and that the rich return we get from that. With respect to renewable energy and its usefulness of hydrogen, there are multiple avenues there. We have an abundant renewable resource in the state, but at times it can be quite isolated. So you get pockets of very high quality wind, which are not large enough, or there's geography in the way to prevent it from actually getting utilized and delivered into a marketplace. So the cost of building that transmission means it is somewhat isolated. If you take that same renewable resource and use it to generate hydrogen, then you achieve a bunch of different things. First of all, you're going up the value chain a little bit. So you get a little extra kick. Instead of just producing electrons, you're producing a commodity. You open up a whole range of different transportation opportunities. You don't have to build an electricity transmission system. You can potentially pipeline it. You could shift it to liquid form, on and on and on, as I discussed earlier, and then access markets differently. Perhaps access existing natural gas pipelines, for example, and open up the market there. One thing that is very important, or potentially very interesting, is the aspect of grid resilience. So the intermittency of a renewable resource could be overcome by using that renewable resource to transformed to hydrogen. You store that on site or in a subsurface at the site while the wind is blowing. When the wind stops blowing, you can bring the hydrogen back, run it through a turbine, and address some of that intermittent supply issue that we have with renewable resources. The integration with low carbon energy sources, that is very much that's a long 10-year plus timeline. But the idea there is that if you have decarbonized hydrogen, perhaps you have air captured CO2, and perhaps you have a small modular reactor with carbon-free electricity, you have all the building parts, building blocks to create synthetic net zero natural gas. And Senator Roth has alluded to this yesterday in some other testimony. If you can produce low emissions natural gas, you can produce low emissions petrochemicals. And if you can produce low emissions petrochemicals, you can produce low emissions plastics, and on and on and on and on. So it's a massive opportunity to suddenly have an incredible value-added opportunity where which displaces the Wyoming's traditional approach to this, which is extract, transport, consume, raw primary resource-based sort of economy, and have a value-added economy that moves us up the value chain. There are other opportunities, certainly. Heavy transport alternative fuels is clearly one. I-25 and I-80 corridor there, interesting aspect of a hydrogen economy in the state. Industrial heat, cement plants, trona facilities, for example. Hydrogen, again, if you can deliver it in sufficient quantity, decarbonized, it gives a good opportunity for them to convert their systems as well. Next slide. So changing gear a little bit, let's talk about hydrogen production. So there has been a lot of emphasis on describing hydrogen production pathways by their color, which is served a purpose, but it has become rather cumbersome and unwieldy as people have come up with different scenarios to describe different combinations of feedstock and energy source. So you would have certainly probably heard of blue hydrogen, which is natural gas, steam methane reforming with carbon capture. That was described as blue. Green hydrogen was used to describe renewables powering electrolyzers. That was green hydrogen. But as that model sort of evolved over time, it became kind of crazy to keep up inventing new colors almost, because you started to get variations. What about steam methane reforming? Instead of steam methane reforming as autothermal reforming, is that still blue, or is it a lighter shade of blue? And what if you're powering your steam methane reformer with renewable power? Is that suddenly teal or something like that? So it gets a little bit crazy, and what people have decided essentially to move away from that system. So everything you've learned over the last year or so, committee members, I'd ask you to forget it. People have moved away from that color scheme, and now we simply talk about hydrogen in the context of its carbon intensity. So the amount of carbon emitted for that unit of hydrogen produced. So when you keep that in mind and you go back to the different methods of production of hydrogen, there really are only two ways you get hydrogen. The first is you take a hydrocarbon or some other organic molecule, which has hydrogen and carbon pads bonded together, and you crack it thermally through pyrolysis or gasification or distillation or some other thermal approach. As it cracks open, you get the carbon on one end and hydrogen on the other. You capture the carbon and you're left with the low carbon intensity hydrogen product. That is one pathway. That's where the steam methane reforming of natural gas that falls into there. Coal gasification falls into that category. So it's a thermal process using an organic molecule. On the other hand, you take the other abundant hydrogen source, water, and you crack it with electrolyzer. The hydrogen and the oxygen breaks, use a membrane, the hydrogen goes to the other side of the membrane, and you have a pure oxygen and a pure hydrogen stream. If you use zero emissions energy to do it, it has zero carbon intensity. So two methods, a thermal method and electrochemical method. And that really is all we're dealing with. Now, important to note, both methods can produce low carbon intensity or low or net zero or even negative carbon intensity hydrogen. The other important thing to note is both methods consume water. Next slide. So
Glenn,
and I'll
what
come back.
slide are you on? Are you on 5?
I am now on, now on 5, sir.
Yeah, okay.
So, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this slide because there's a lot to digest. Okay, so I'll start on the left-hand side. We're looking at the announced clean hydrogen capacity through 2030, and I want to clarify that those trends, the numbers that they're presenting there, that is clean hydrogen. So hydrogen that meets some level, some criteria with respect to its carbon intensity. I'll start off by saying this is a global number too. It's a global forecast. Current global hydrogen production is about 75 million tons per year. Okay, so that's the base, let's say traditional hydrogen production, 75 million tons. And most of it occurs, half of it occurs in refining, the other half occurs in production of ammonia for fertilizer and agricultural ingredients. So this projection is essentially incremental on that existing 75 million. Okay, so a few things to point out here. The first of all is that, you know, look at the 2020 number. They don't have a nice vertical axis on this, but that is something less than 1 million tons. So in 2020, less than 1 million tons of hydrogen production compared to 75 million tons of traditional hydrogen production. Less than 1 million ton is described as clean or having a low carbon intensity. Over the next 10 years, it's expected to ramp up to as much as 6.7 million tons per year. This is global numbers, remember. By comparison, in the United States, the United States number for 2030, it's about 1.4 million tons per year of clean hydrogen production. Start to look at some of the mixes. If you look at the low carbon versus renewable, low carbon is essentially natural gas with carbon capture. It's about 30% through that route and 70% through renewables. It's an interesting observation. They also model a great deal of build out in the years 2025 and 2026. That seems to be when they're predicting a lot of this stuff will come on. And then another very interesting observation that I made is if you look at that top line, that's projections from 2020. Okay? And then down the column, there's a dashed line there, projections from 2019. And if you see that from one year to the next, their projections tripled. Okay, so I haven't seen a 2021 projection or even a 2022. I suspect that these numbers are out of date and vastly conservative. So I suspect these projections are very much on the low side. So the next thing I'm just going to get ready to take notes because I'm going to start to throw some numbers at you here to help you understand what this means, because I look at these numbers and I have no idea what a ton of hydrogen really means. I think in oil and gas, so I think of barrels of oil, scuffs of natural gas. I don't really know what a ton of hydrogen means. So bear with me here. So 1 ton of hydrogen is roughly equivalent to 100,000 standard cubic feet of natural gas. Okay, so I'll say it again. 1 ton of hydrogen, 100,000 scuffs of gas. 1 ton of hydrogen is roughly equivalent to 21 barrels of oil. So 1 ton of hydrogen, 21 barrels of oil. So now we're dealing with units that I can actually make sense of. Okay, so remember that I threw out the number for United States projection in 2030 is to be 1.4 million tons of hydrogen production, clean hydrogen. That's roughly equivalent to 30 million barrels of oil. Okay, so the United States consumes about 20 million barrels of oil every day. So we're only talking about 1.5 days worth of oil consumption in terms of our hydrogen production over the next 10 years. Bring it back to home again, 1.4 million tons.
Mr. Chairman.
1 ton of hydrogen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glenn, could you repeat those equivalent numbers for us, please?
You bet. So 1 ton of hydrogen, 100,000 scuffs of natural gas.
What was it?
Standard cubic feet.
Okay.
Thank you.
And 1 ton of hydrogen is roughly equivalent to 21 barrels of oil.
21?
Yes, sir.
No, I had 121.
So I'll proceed, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please.
Okay, so that helps me understand, right, what we're talking about. It is an incredible increase. This is all incremental in the existing hydrogen system, but it's, we've got a long way to go before we displace the existing sort of energy capacity of the country, let alone globally, right? Even though we're going to have some rapid build out of this hydrogen economy, lots of work to go. Draw your attention to the graph on the right-hand side. That is the comparative production cost, or and indeed the cost curves over the next 30 years. And being somewhat cynical, I say good luck to the analyst who tries to predict a cost curve that goes out 30 years. That's a bold piece of analysis, but they've done it anyway. To talk through that graph there's a green envelope which shows the expected cost curve for renewable production of hydrogen. At the bottom there's a gray envelope which shows current steam methane reforming and natural gas costs over the next 30 years. And then there's a blue envelope which shows essentially it's natural gas with carbon capture. So I just want to draw your attention to some of those comparisons. Currently, renewables generated hydrogen is 4 to 5 to 6 times that of the cost of just running an SMR and emitting the CO2. That cost curve, as it comes down drastically, right? And I always look at this graph pops up in all sorts of reports. You'll see it everywhere. And I always look at that cost curve and think, wow, that's a heck of a reduction. How are they going to do that? And in this analysis, they share some of the key assumptions. I draw your attention to the bottom left corner of that graph. They share what their assumptions going in terms of levelized cost of electricity. And if I cut to the chase, that reduction in cost is almost entirely accounted for by the reduction of the cost of renewable energy production. It's not related to improvements in electrolyzers. They're really just modeling the cost reduction of the input energy. And some of their assumptions are very interesting. In the year 2050, they're predicting that the cost of electricity is going to be 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And well, that's pretty cheap electricity. The other thing that always makes me raise an eyebrow when I look at this graph is that the cost of steam methane reforming is flat for the next 30 years. I also have doubts about whether that's a real model or not. Anyhow, like I said earlier, any analyst who takes on the job of trying to predict a cost curve for the next 30 years, I'll tip my hat to them. The only thing we know for certain about that prediction is that it's wrong. I think it's accurate in terms of trend, but I'm not going to bet the house on any of it. Next slide, committee. I think I'm on slide 6. Changing gear again, let's think about hydrogen in Wyoming. Is what's going on. There's a ton going on, really. The public sector, a lot of it's been driven by the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Dr. Krutker and her team are just doing tremendous work in building a capacity there to try and understand those white paper issues, the roadmaps, the work that needs to be done to realize this economic opportunity. At the Energy Authority, we're taking more of a strategic position at the state level. We've integrated into the Wyoming energy strategy. We have put out a little bit of funding to really test our assumptions and our knowledge about the sector in Wyoming and explore that. I'm very happy to announce that we plan to issue a coal to hydrogen RFP before the end of next week. Excited to get that one out. We've been working on it for far too long, and it's finally actually going to get posted. We of course have the the Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And I also want to mention the tremendous work that collaborative work that we've undertaken with Cheyenne Lead's development of a hydrogen status report and a very high level roadmap. So plenty of work just building the foundation as best we can. In the private sector, there's a lot going on. This is the list here that I've shown you as those projects that are public. You can Google these things and find out what's going on. There are public projects that actually I forgot to put on there. There's a very good, interesting project by clean energy holdings around Medicine Bow. It's a smaller scale one, but it's a very interesting prospect. There's a bunch of non-public projects that I haven't mentioned here. But I can tell you that, if I do a little bit of mental math and add up the capital expense of all these projects, we very quickly get to somewhere in excess of $20+ billion worth of capital deployment associated with these projects over the next 5 or 10 years. In terms of the number of projects, most of them are natural gas centric, probably about a 2-to-1 in terms of the ratio. Importantly, none of these are dependent on any sort of infrastructure funding. They are all commercially developed projects. They're not dependent on getting any money from the infrastructure bill or anything like that. They are out there, they recognize the commercial viability, and they're going after it. So the question then is why? So why is there such a great deal of interest in Wyoming? Next slide, please. Slide 7. So Wyoming has a lot of strengths, and the weaknesses, I would say, are manageable. So the strengths really come in terms of feedstock diversity and abundance. We have everything you possibly might need. We have a lot of coal, a lot of natural gas, we have a lot of renewables, we have the potential to have nuclear in the near term, in the near future. So that's an incredible resource, and there are numbers that are kicked around that we have, a very large proportion of the nation's feedstock is actually within Wyoming. So we're blessed in that sense. Geographic location, strength and a weakness, really. Our strength is that we're very nicely located in a strategic sense, being in the central part of the country. The big markets, the West Coast, East Coast, South Coast, having a location in the middle of it all allows us to access multiple potential demand centers for the hydrogen that's going to be produced in the state. We have a lot of the associated infrastructure, a lot of pipeline, a lot of natural gas gathering and systems, for example, a lot of transmission, a lot of rail, road, everything else. The I-80 corridor is in many ways a very strategic energy infrastructure piece, and we're starting to lean on that characteristic a lot when we're in our conversations with the East Coast, pointing out that the I-80 corridor, the entire system, is a strategic asset, not just for Wyoming, but for the nation, and needs to have investment in there. Perhaps most important is our CO2 management infrastructure and the policy work that has gone on for the last decade and a half. It's incredibly important. It's working out very well. I really cannot overstate the importance of that aspect in today's hydrogen environment, okay? So we're talking about the Pipeline Corridor Initiative, we're talking about Class 6 well primacy, talking about pore space ownership certainty, we're talking about the stewardship bill that's still under discussion, and talking about the existing pipeline systems, we're talking about the existing and well-modeled sequestration capacity. That is drawing a lot of attention from private partners because we have it all in one place. And it's not just about hydrogen. I'm very happy to inform you that there are at least 2 direct air capture projects being explored in the state because of this characteristic. So it's kudos to this committee. The hard work over the last 10 years has set up the state very, very well for what is coming next. And it's starting to pay off literally today. It is starting to pay off. The weaknesses are, like I said, manageable, I think. Water is incredibly important aspect of this entire opportunity. I think the next slide, or maybe a couple of slides on, I'll talk about more specifics. But it's not a unique challenge to Wyoming. The entire arid West is faced with the same problem, right? Where more and more water use is going to be issue, whether it's for hydrogen or any other development opportunity. Storage is kind of particular. If you look at Utah or even New Mexico, I believe they have salt domes where they can use those to store the hydrogen once it's produced. If Wyoming is going to take that upstream position where we're going to be a producer of hydrogen, we need to figure out some form of storage for to act as a balancing function for those pipeline troughs and peaks. We're probably going to have to use depleted gas fields and things like that to store our hydrogen. And the issue is that nobody really has a solid grasp on subsurface pore space behavior of hydrogen and how it works in terms of injection, storage, and production of that gas. There's work to be done, and the work is ongoing already. Geographic location is also somewhat of a weakness. We are well positioned, but we're quite distant from those markets. So you need You need the same way that renewable resources have to have a critical size in order to justify the transmission. The same sort of issues exist with hydrogen. We have to have a large amount, we have to be taking a very big position in production in order to justify the transmission systems to deliver it to market. And demand pull is the other big one. We don't have a big offtake in the state, right? That's the biggest. We have plenty of supply, not enough demand. Next slide. That last point brings me to the Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub. So this is a formal collaboration that has been formalized through Memorandum of Understanding with the 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. The intent of that is to lock those 4 states into one single collective application to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act hydrogen program. The infrastructure bill hydrogen program appropriates $8 billion for development of at least 4 hydrogen infrastructure hubs dispersed throughout the country. There are various criteria, and I'll talk about them in the next slide, to build these things out and hopefully actually establish a national system. Okay, having the 4 states together boosts the strengths and addresses the weaknesses of the individual states. Right, for example, the value completion. Wyoming partnering with Colorado, you suddenly have that demand center, right? You can produce a lot of hydrogen in the state and deliver it into the Denver metropole, just as an example. Or the southwest of Wyoming, you can head west to Utah and further afield. There's even more feedstock diversity. We have a lot of different things. There's even the aspect of having 4 states with diverse political positioning, but a common vision. That works well when you're trying to put together these applications. So the coalition greatly strengthens the hub application overall and the concept in the region. Today it's all about hydrogen, but personally, and I'm not going to speak for my colleagues in the other states, but personally, I see this coalition working beyond that. It's not just hydrogen. We could be working on CO2 sequestration hubs or CO2 infrastructure pieces or whatever you might think in terms of a regional context. And that is lacking in this region. And we need a center of gravity in this region to pull away some of the attention away from the West Coast, the East Coast, the South Coast, and draw more of these programs into this regional aspect. So I'm looking forward to pursuing that in time as well. There've already been several positive unforeseen consequences. Projects and companies that were looking to deploy into Colorado have now, because of this partnership, are looking to see how Wyoming can be incorporated into their plans and their development intentions over the next 5 years. So it's working out well. Next slide, which is slide 9. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I can barely read it. It's too small. It's a laundry list for you to look through to see. This is what the DOE expects from a successful hydrogen hub. And I can pull out a few things. Employ workers currently employed in the fossil industry, complete the value chain, potential to develop into a national hydrogen network, availability of necessary hydrogen infrastructure, including feedstocks and permanently sequestered CO2, effectiveness of regional resources and markets. So as you work through this list, Wyoming and this hub coalition checks all the boxes very, very well. And I think in general, we still have to do the work, but we're in pretty good shape. Next slide, onto water use.
Yeah,
We
Mr.
got a
Chairman.
question here.
Yeah, Dr. Morrell, okay, so at a higher level, just explain to me what the term is of hydrogen, what a hydrogen hub means.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have a follow-up question regarding some of the requirements of this infrastructure bill, having to look at the current sustainable agriculture program I've been working with. So, anyway.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Greer. Yeah, so the hub term has been thrown out liberally and and loosely. And what we're talking about, when one thinks of a hub, I immediately think to a network model, hub and spoke sort of system. The corollary in the state would be OPAL, right? The gathering system for natural gas, compression, treatment, and then export. That is a very intuitive way to think about it, but it's not accurate in terms of what the infrastructure bill is talking about. the infrastructure bill and what we're pursuing as a region is really the initiation of a hydrogen economy, not necessarily hard infrastructure that fits that model of hub and spoke. So if you look at the 4 states, that regional hub concept could include a production center in Cheyenne that transports hydrogen into the Denver metropole. And that's one piece of the infrastructure. Then it could also include a Southwest Wyoming hydrogen production center, which is transmitting or transporting hydrogen to the Salt Lake City area and down perhaps into Delta, the Intermontane project and further afield. The same sort of model in New Mexico, there could be a center there producing and delivering into Denver. And so that doesn't really fit the classic hub and spoke model, but there are components of infrastructure there which initiate the development of a hydrogen economy in the area. Does that help you, Co-Chair Greer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I've just, again, looking at the states that we've agreed to cooperate with and not compete with, which I agree is a good idea. The reason I was asking that question is, are we, is a hub, a more central distribution location better suited in the Four Corners area to be transported from Wyoming to, and so I guess when I see the term hub, I think of the distribution center that might be more closely related or centralized within the consumption zone. So that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair Greer, that is a very intuitive way to look at it. And we have had positive feedback that our approach, which is more of a distributed initiation of a hydrogen system overall, does conform with the hub concept. Looking back, I think the people who wrote the infrastructure bill might want to withdraw their use of the word hub. I think it could be more accurately described as regional hydrogen infrastructure systems, rather than use the word hub specifically, because it does lead one's mind down a different pathway.
Okay. And then, Mr. Chairman, I guess I was looking through and I didn't see it in your material, but I was reading somewhere regarding this DOE grant, which seems to be sort of a condition I'm seeing on a lot of current federal initiatives, which was a very large emphasis on disadvantaged populations, minorities, and I'm going to use the terms wrong, and it's difficult for Wyoming to meet that criteria.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair Greer, you're right. You're correct. It is actually mentioned in this laundry list of items there. It comes under the EEJ strategy. And I don't ask me what the acronym really means, but it's the environmental justice. I think it's energy equity and environmental justice, I think, is what the acronym stands for. And the common way to interpret that is, as you described, how it impacts minority groups and everything else. And as you know, those demographics don't work well for Wyoming with respect to some of those programs. And we saw the same example of that just last year in October with the Build Back Better program. This model is somewhat different, and Wyoming does have a pretty strong argument because of the impacted communities with respect to our traditional energy industries. This definition does enable us to use to address those criteria with respect to how those communities may be impacted through the energy transition, and that's how the strategy is built. So hopefully, I sincerely hope that those metrics are adapted and adjusted, and it does not become an impediment for Wyoming's success in this space.
Glenn, the group of 4 Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub guys, is that a fluid number? Can they come and go, or can we add the Dakotas or Montana or something like that, or is that a closed club?
No, Mr. Chairman, excuse me. It is not closed. It is open to additional membership. It has to be unanimous agreement from the current members, but it can grow, and it could very well make sense to add other states, neighboring states, if it makes a better application. Certainly.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll proceed.
Please do.
Okay, so we're back onto water use, slide 10. We'll probably spend a little bit of time here as well. So I'm going to start with two important caveats, and I've listed those caveats in that big blue box on the right there, down the bottom. The first one is, it surprised me that it's extremely difficult to get good data on water use. This is the best one I managed to find. It's from the Argonne National Lab, dated 2016. But having a comprehensive analysis that covers all the different feedstock and methodologies and things like that, the incorporation of carbon capture, for example, it's not really there. Or at least I couldn't find it. And so it just highlights we still have to do a lot more work on what water use is really going to do. The other important caveat is that this sort of analysis is just like emissions profiles. They're subject to something called life cycle analysis. And life cycle analysis is notoriously sensitive to various things. It's notoriously sensitive to the scenario that you're actually modeling. Are you using a steam methane reformer? What about a steam methane reformer with renewable energy? What about autothermal reforming? What about, it's at every single variation of that adds sensitivity into the use. Where you draw the boundary impacts it massively. If you're just looking at the steam methane reformer, well, what about upstream water use or downstream water use? Where do you draw the line about what you're modeling itself? And then the input assumptions also are really impactful. What about water leakage? You could go from, is it 10% to 20%? And that could have heavy impact on the total use. So that's my opening pitch of take what you're seeing with a very large grain of salt, okay? Because there has to be a lot more work to understand this accurately. But this is the best numbers I could find. On the left-hand graph there, you see two circles. The left-hand circle shows natural gas, steam methane reforming. The right one is wind-based electrolysis. And if you look at the consumption bars there, pay attention to the feedstock recovery, that darker color there. The two major production methodologies for hydrogen, they consume about the same amount of water, about 5 gallons per kilogram. Is very comparable. There's not a lot of variation there. Again, I think in oil and gas, so I converted that's actually 120 barrels per ton of production. When you start to use some of those numbers I showed you earlier about global production, United States production, global production in 2030, that equates to about 800 million barrels of water. United States projected production in 2030, that would equal about 165 million barrels of water per year. Okay, so again, you start to get into this familiarity issue. That sounds like a big number. 165 million barrels is a lot of water. There's no question about it. But how does that relate to everyday life? For the people who are more familiar with agriculture and other things, that's about 21,000 acre feet per year. Okay, so 21,000 acre feet, how much water is that? Seminole Reservoir, and when it's full, has a surface area of about 20,000 acres. So if you took the surface area of Seminole when it's full, went down 1 foot, that volume of water is approximately what we're talking about for that projected water use. Another interesting number, just to keep in your back of your head, is that according to the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the oil and gas industry in Wyoming produces 125 million barrels of water per month. Okay, so these projections are serious. They're absolutely real. They're serious. I trust my math. I'm a geologist, so who knows? But I'm pretty confident that I have good understanding of the water use according to these projections. And it is a serious number, but I'm confident that it is not insurmountable. I think we can manage that level of water use according to those projections that we're looking at.
Glenn, could we use production water for this? Does it have to be absolutely clean, or could we quit injecting so much water and use it for this?
Mr. Chairman, potentially, sure. There's all, if you're, I mean, both methods would be subject to scale and precipitation through the system. One would want to use as clean water as you possibly can to go through those systems. Otherwise, you're gonna gunk up your production system, right? And I certainly by no means want to imply that if the oil and gas produces 125 million barrels of water, problem solved. By no means at all, because a lot of that water has to be re-injected, has to be treated, has other obligations on it. It's just for a matter of comparison and help us understand what really we're talking about. But to your question, Mr. Chairman, yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that many of the producers or prospective producers in Wyoming are absolutely considering if they can apply produced water to their systems. Proceed, Mr. Chairman.
Please do.
Okay, so moving on to general policy directions and considerations, that's slide 11. So general policy directions, this is just a sampling of various things that are happening elsewhere in the country. It's actually not my work. I failed to add the attribution. This is from the Western Green Hydrogen Initiative. My apologies to that organization for not referencing them accurately. But they fall into 4 buckets currently throughout the country. There's a lot of effort around market standardization. So they're trying to understand what this carbon intensity framework or metric criteria really means. They're trying to understand what this life cycle assessment, whether it's emissions or water use, standardize it so that we have a common rule. The next big bucket is really technology mandates. So a lot of actors are trying to push the technology into the market. So they're mandating a certain level of consumption or production or injection into the pipeline systems or something like that. As a corollary to that, they're then having to come through with support mechanisms to back up that. If you're going to force the technology to the market, you're going to have to subsidize it as well. So they're talking about state level investment tax credits, production tax credits, that kind of thing, incentives for using the hydrogen, those sort of ideas. Inclusion in renewable portfolio standards is another good one. It comes up a lot. And then the last bucket there, it's labeled as market creation. I look at those examples, it's more about regulatory clarity and streamlining of process. So that's the other effort group that is being pursued in other states in the country, and actually other countries as well, looking at many of these same things. Next slide, if you take some of the considerations specific to Wyoming, they map very well with what is happening elsewhere. A framework for evaluation recognition, that standardization is important because you have to set that in order for these other things to apply. We're not talking about traditional hydrogen. It has to meet this clean hydrogen standard or the criteria. So it could be many of the other states are simply borrowing the federal criteria, which is 2 kilograms of CO2 produced per kilogram of hydrogen. That's the easiest thing for people to adopt. Although they are certainly adopting more of a ramp. So they say that is aspirational in 2035 or something, and they want to reach that standard over time. A framework for long-term utility planning. So they're wanting to ensure that the utilities, regulated utilities, incorporate hydrogen into their both the electricity generation side of the utilities story, but as well as the natural gas utilities. Do the statutes and regulations incorporate hydrogen? For Wyoming, one thing that has to be looked at or should be looked at is whether House Bill 200 has consideration of co-firing or conversion to hydrogen. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if it has to be considered, but we at least have to review it. There's a lot of, I guess there's potential certainly for cost-centric sort of incentives. If there's some sort of system to incentivize production or use of hydrogen. And I gave a couple of examples where people are trying that in different states. As it applies to Wyoming, the one consideration would be whether the 2 competing methodologies in Wyoming, natural gas or renewables, they both have production of severance taxes associated with them, could that be, one could conceive of the idea of rebating the production of the severance tax in order to spur development of the economy overall over time. Demand creation, this is an interesting one. Potential to have a public-private partnership, for example, might fit in here. If you look at the Cheyenne area, there's a lot of fleet. There's a lot of vehicle fleets. There's the state fleets, there's a military fleet. There are distribution centers with forklift fleets. There's a lot of interstate transportation going through there. So could we consider building a distribution system facility really in the Cheyenne area and incentivize development or spur the interest in that space locally? One thing that's important, it pertains to the idea of how does Wyoming store hydrogen? Subsurface storage in Wyoming is going to probably be in a depleted oil and gas field. So the question becomes, do the Wyoming specific or even the FERC ideas around pore space ownership, unitization, well permitting statutes, and so on, do they accommodate the concept of injection, storage, and withdrawal of hydrogen? It's an open question. I don't know the answer to that, but it's something we probably should look at.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
So, Glenn, I just want to flesh out a couple of things here. And I guess my first question is with respect to a facility that was to produce hydrogen in Wyoming, the tax structure would be subject to our typical property taxes. What other taxes are associated with the hydrogen, with the produced hydrogen that is later sold? What's that tax structure look like?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I'm not an expert on it. Don't really know, because it depends. I think in my mind, it depends on which route you're going through. If it's a renewably sourced hydrogen, or if it's a hydrocarbon sourced hydrogen, the structures will be different. If you're producing natural gas, you're paying severance tax ad valorem and so on associated with it. Then it hits the production facility, which is probably centralized. That facility would certainly have paid property tax during its construction, but then it's essentially, it follows the model of a refinery. That system follows the model of a refinery, I think. If you're going through the renewables path, I imagine it's probably slightly different. That has a production tax on the electricity and has had sales and use on the construction of the system. This is where I fail in my understanding. I do not know whether if you attached an electrolyzer to that wind facility, I'm not sure how that is going to be structured. And
Mr. Chairman, I guess, when we want to talk about, policy considerations for the state of Wyoming, is I'd like to know what the tax structure is, because to me, this is a manufacturing process, and so you've got the end product. While we're subject to property taxes, both real and personal property taxes, I don't see a severance tax associated with this. And so I just think that's one we got to know is what is that tax structure and what does it mean? The second, and I think, either we can do that or we can have LSO look at that for us. The next component on this is is the storage component.
mm-hmm.
And so I've received emails and inquiries from different folks in this realm, and I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding by them regarding how far forward Wyoming has moved with respect to ownership of pore space and regulation of that pore space, and also unitization. And so I guess I'm just curious what WEA has done in terms of putting together that type of information for people looking at Wyoming.
So, Mr. Chairman, the question about tax structure, yeah, it's a good one, and it's not unique to Wyoming. That people in other states are also scratching their head in terms of how this is really going to impact state revenues locally. With respect to the storage, the WEA has not, we have not even started to look at the hydrogen storage aspect. We're certainly addressing the sequestration aspect as best we can and helping people understand what is available. So that's a work to be addressed yet. How does subsurface storage of hydrogen work? Again, not a unique problem to Wyoming. That's a national problem. Nobody really knows.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm 10 years ago or so, we saw the modeling of the Rock Springs uplift with University of Wyoming. Went through the modeling, and it was for Wyoming trying to be on the leading edge of CO2 sequestration. And so it's my understanding some of that modeling has been shared with companies, which is a good thing. It's publicly generated. Is the model moving forward with respect to storage and any unknowns we can eliminate for industry? Can we follow the same pathway that we have for CO2? And if we can, that's simple. In my opinion, that's done very easily.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, yeah, I think that is a very valid and important way forward. There's a lot of work to be done yet, right? There's almost fundamental research in terms of how these things, how a molecule of hydrogen behaves. But I believe the School of Energy Resources is doing the work that you described and adapting their knowledge with respect to subsurface storage of CO2 and adapting it for hydrogen. And once that work is done, there is, that is a very clear and obvious path forward to push that out and make sure that our industry partners have that information.
So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I'm looking at, this has been a very this meeting was informational in nature, educational for the committee and the public alike on some very good issues. You listened yesterday as we went through the description and discussion of Class 6 wells and Class 2 wells and how that relates within one, the hydrocarbon nexus with the Class 2, but then also the CO2 storage, which is long-term sequestration. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is that if we're able to put together a regulatory framework or statutory framework that provides certainty, at least around the storage component where the state of Wyoming's been on the leading edge, we need to know that, and let's go ahead and get the committee working on that and getting it discussed and ready and teed up to be vetted at the next session.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, I totally agree that some of the feedback that I got from the partners, they seem to be placing the most urgency in terms of policy on continuing to work the CO2 storage angle, as we did work through yesterday. I think we're talking about sequencing, really. Keep working that problem because it's important and it has flow-on effects in different ways. There will absolutely be the same role to play in terms of addressing the hydrogen storage regulatory space that we've discussed, the corollary to CO2. But that's we have a little bit of time to do that work and understand the implications and the gaps, I guess. And I use that word poorly because I'm not trying to say there are gaps in the current CO2 space, but gaps as that pertains to hydrogen storage. We need to understand that, identify those gaps, and we can bring it back to the committee to address.
So Mr. Chairman, I guess, and Glenn, I knowing very little about this is a temporary storage, right? Is it similar to storage for natural gas, or is it similar to storage that you would use for CO2?
It's more.
Or is there a difference? I don't know.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
I'm an economist with a law degree, so I know none of this stuff.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair, it's closer to the natural gas storage example that you have because you are bringing it in and out. And that's where the physics are certainly different. With CO2, the longer it's there, the longer it's going to stay there, that the risk goes down. When it's a natural gas system, pulling it in and out, you have hysteresis issues and all sorts of weird things. And that's where the gap of scientific knowledge exists. And again, it's not Wyoming, it's globally. Nobody really has a good handle on those physics problems as it relates to hydrogen. So so it's not just looking at the CO2 pore space issues. There are corollaries there, but you'd also have to address the natural gas storage system. And that actually opens up another door I don't want to open is that natural gas storage is typically regulated by FERC. And I hope because of the efficiency issues that hydrogen storage for the same context is not. Hopefully that becomes a state primacy issue.
So Glenn, could we store hydrogen in the same area we're storing natural gas, or because it's covered with FERC, we wouldn't do that?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, there is a technical answer to that and a policy answer. Technically, you could, but in terms of policy and regulatory environment, I think you would want to avoid that.
I think proceed. We're just
Chatting.
Just checking. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think we skipped by that. Final slide, Mr. Chairman, slide 13. It's simply what's next. This is a very near-term what's next. Continuing to work with Cheyenne Leads on the reports and roadmaps regarding hydrogen. I think even in this conversation, we've identified new things to look at more closely. Want to a bit of a plug for our summit coming up on May 11th and 12th in Cheyenne. There'll be two or three hydrogen specific projects presented at that summit. To getting a bit more broader, we're about to start the formation of an action team. The Wyoming Energy Authority is 4 people, right? And we are running out of horsepower to keep developing the energy strategy moving forward. So this will be a group that is convened from the industry to help us understand what we're dealing with in terms of energy and help us move that forward. And the big effort is we expect the funding opportunity from the infrastructure bill to be released by May 15. May 15 is essentially a drop dead date. It's going to come out before then. We then probably have 90 days to turn around on our application. So that's going to dominate a lot of our effort with respect to hydrogen, not just the Energy Authority, the School of Energy Resources and others will be deeply involved in that. With that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my testimony and I stand ready for questions.
Glenn, why are they putting H2 on their leads thing? Why H2? Just
Why?
H.
So, Mr. Chairman, H2 is the molecule. When hydrogen exists in its natural state, it typically bonds with something, and in the absence of a carbon molecule or something like that, it bonds with itself. It bonds with another element of itself. So a hydrogen molecule has 2 hydrogen atoms in it.
But on the periodic table, it's just H.
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
Okay. Questions for Glenn? Oh, right here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Glenn. On slide 1, it says Wyoming Energy Strategy, primary objective, empowering our nation with all of the above net zero energy mix. Certainly, that's not what I voted for when I voted to create the Energy Authority. When we combine the Pipeline Authority with the Infrastructure Authority, that primary objective sounds awfully woke to me. It sounds like the California Energy Strategy, not the Wyoming Energy Strategy. And I'm wondering, who sets that policy? I would think the legislature would set policy like that. That's a pretty bold policy in the state of Wyoming. Is it the governor's office? Is it the Energy Authority itself? Who determined that our primary objective is going to be a net zero energy mix?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Brightman, the Energy Authority has a statutory obligation to develop, administer, and communicate and update the energy strategy. So we built the strategy and incorporated that primary objective. The primary objective recognizes that our market being, natural gas in California, coal into Texas, doesn't really matter where you look, the majority of consumers have an increasing demand for low emissions energy. So if we want to continue to serve those markets, that we should take a position that we're going to have in all of the above, but constrained by net zero energy mix. To your specific question about who sets policy, I do not set policy. That's this committee, and the legislature sets policy.
Go ahead.
I don't remember ever voting on setting our policy as a net zero Green New Deal type of policy. When we were sold the Energy Authority, it was to streamline the Pipeline Authority and Infrastructure Authority and combine them and make it more efficient. We've gone from that in just a couple of years to this. To me, it's pretty alarming. And we set the policy. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, yeah. Chuck, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to state for the record, you know, I said this at the Laramie meeting. I think I don't agree with that. And I don't know if we need to get involved statutorily, but I do not think that that is consistent with what, as Senator Beitman said, consistent with what we voted for and consistent with, I think, the legislative intent and the values of our state legislature. So, I mean, I want to see more coal export stuff. I mean, that was in the original authority a big part of what they were talking about. That's in the combined statute. I think that was there as well. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, comments for Mr. Morrell and the WA? Oh, one more.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My other question revolves around, I did some quick research on the technology involving converting seawater to hydrogen, because obviously that's 96% of our water on the planet is saltwater. And it shows promise from Stanford University and other research institutions that are able to use that conversion. If that would be a game changer, right? If California could just produce ocean water into hydrogen, we're wasting our time here in Wyoming. This is a expensive boondoggle for nothing if that turns out to be feasible. So could you explain a little bit about that technology, what you know about it, how far along they are in that process of being able to convert seawater to hydrogen? Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Beitman, the technology is pretty basic. It's a standard electrolyzer system. The simple effort is that you have to pre-treat it. You have to drop the salts out, and then it's there. Desalination is expensive, and it's very energy rich. You have to consume a lot of energy through a reverse osmosis system to get those salts out, and then you can run it through an electrolyzer and generate hydrogen. Generating hydrogen using electrolyzer currently with fresh water, go back to page, whatever it was, page 5, is already 5 times more expensive than using natural gas. So if you want to desalinate seawater before you go into it, you're adding more cost. So the answer really is competitiveness over time, right? We are better positioned now to get ahead of that curve. If they come in and somehow manage to drop that price down to competitive levels, yeah, it's going to be a problem, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Follow-up question?
Yeah, so I guess specifically what this research was, it was forward osmosis, which led them to be able to split the water for energy uses using forward osmosis, and it was showing a lot of promise. Therefore, you don't need to purify the water. You don't need purified water. You just skip that whole step and just produce hydrogen straight from the salt water.
Are you familiar with that one, Glenn?
No, I'm a simple, Mr. Chairman, I'm a simple geologist, and my chemical engineering is a little weak. I still think that if it's a nascent technology, that cost curve has a long way to go.
Okay. Other questions? Other questions? No further questions from the committee? Is that the end of your presentation? The rest of it is just information for us?
Yes, sir. That's the end.
Okay. All right. All right. Is there any public comment on hydrogen? Any public comment on hydrogen? Yeah, we got one. We got one on the Zoom. None in the room, one on the Zoom? None on the Zoom. Okay. We won't hear from the Zoom then. I guess that's a wrap on that then. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for all your input. You'll hear from us in the future about this. We are excited about hydrogen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members.
Yep, thank you. I think that wraps our issues for the day. I wanted to thank the staff for hanging in here with us. We appreciate you spending the 2 days with us, and you're obviously helping run the meeting. Thank you very much. Do we have, you have some issues? that we have to
Yeah,
follow up on?
sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
I'm gonna work right to the end. So I'll rattle these off, and if the committee has input or objection, just go ahead and say so, okay? I think it would be, one, to have a follow-up letter to the supervisor of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission from the committee to ask for progress with respect to A&I on getting a proper definition for a petroleum engineer and then also an appropriate salary. I trust Supervisor Kopratz to do that, but trust but verify. So follow-up letter there. The second thing I would ask for LSO is if we could get a memo, and I'm going to say this maybe a little bit wrong, but what are the state areas where the commission, Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, could assert control or primacy, whatever term is appropriate, with respect to federal exploratory units to ensure, so we don't get 3 years for a mineral owner waiting for the BLM to decide how much their check is. And there may be some other areas. Is that doable, Mr. Fuller?
I think so, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Okay, I'll keep going. I would, I guess, do we want to get a bill draft committee to repeal that apprenticeship preference set of statutes? I guess.
Sure, it sure sounds to me like we need to do that. No reason to do it if they aren't using it, so I think we should get a bill draft going for
Okay.
that.
Then next, maybe Senator Wasserberger, is could we get a review or a summary of the Wisconsin program? Maybe the working group on that could take a look at that, make some suggestions or recommendations of how Wyoming could actually have a program through their K-12 system that works with apprenticeships.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
we can start looking into that and make a recommendation.
I had Katie Legursky had sent me sent me something on that. I'll forward that email to you, and then maybe we coordinate and follow up to see if there's an effective way. Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that we set up a subcommittee to meet with industry and either attend, and we can discuss this with Management Council for expenses to attend, but with what was called a technical conference.
yes.
With respect to the deregulated power zones. It was my understanding, obviously Senator Rothfuss, I understood Senator Beitman was interested in that Representative Gray was interested. And then I think, even though he's not really interested, we would force Representative Ayer to attend for a balanced
He's not
view.
here to defend himself, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, well, he has background in that. Representative Gray, are you good with being on that subcommittee?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I definitely, I would wonder, could we maybe have some authority to draft a couple concepts? I mean, I I think, I was talking with Senator Rothfuss, he's got 3 concepts, he wanted to look at. You want to wait till the second meeting till we come back, or?
What I would like is, if you could if that subcommittee can put together some suggestions in whatever form, if it's a roughed out draft bill, if it all depends upon LSO's time and our turnaround is that, that'd be great.
The thing of it is, it might not require statute. It might require something else that we don't know right now. And that's, of course, why the technical group is being put together to see what we can actually do. And maybe there's not anything, I don't know. But we sure ought to look into it.
But Mr. Fuller,
Mr. Chairman, the only question I'd have would be, my understanding is a technical conference is something the PSC. Certainly, the committee can do a working group, but if we're looking for something, that the PSC is organizing, then I think that would.
You're absolutely right. Well, so the PSC would have their technical conference, which would be a public meeting that's informal that our subcommittee could attend. But I think that could turn into a little bit of a working session, and then the subcommittee could come out with recommendations 1, 2, 3. And all depends upon our turnaround time to our next meeting. Is those could come in a bill draft or just even in a bullet point for us to put something more together at our second meeting. So yes, that's a good point. The other thing which I guess, could LSO put together a brief memo regarding what would be the tax effect or tax structure, and this do something in terms of a $100 million hydrogen facility with 100,000 a year ton, 100,000 tons a year production. What is that? What is the tax structure look like? I'm surprised that we haven't done that analysis within the state. Is that workable? I know you guys are down on analysts.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we can try to look into that. Just off the top, I'm unaware of, our tax structure explicitly mentioning hydrogen. We actually do discuss helium, and helium is taxed ad valorem itself. I don't know of any similar language for hydrogen, though, in our statutes.
Okay.
But there would be taxes on that plant and on all the equipment and that kind of things. I think that's what we're looking for, is what would the tax consequence be of a facility like that? Yes, I think we ought to do something with taxing hydrogen, but first there's that facility that would pay a lot of taxes.
Yep. So Mr. Chairman, then is the request then just a hypothetical? Here's what taxes would be generated, assuming $100 million valued facility that produces 100,000 tons of hydrogen a year.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking for something that's easy to understand.
That
Okay.
100,000 tons might be a stretch, but whatever that is, if it's 10,000 tons or whatever that size
It could be
facility.
but just use where we can move decimals and make it for that analysis purpose. Well, and part of this is my frustration is we get asked to consider policy or to help with policy, and yet no one's told us what the tax structure is. So then, in that same vein of being, is I guess if the committee's up to this, is I would write a letter to a committee letter to the Wyoming Energy Authority requesting that they put out a technical memo regarding unitization and the statutory structure surrounding CO2 storage and sequestration. I've received emails from people in the hydrogen sector who say we need to change our policy because they're concerned about pore space, and I'm just shocked that we don't have a 2-page, technical advice memorandum regarding what Wyoming has already done. So I guess that would be a formal way of asking of maybe that would be a good place to start.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay. I'm done complaining.
Anything else that, yes, Representative Heinrich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my congratulations for the last couple of days and all the information that we received. And been very informative for me. We've talked about repurposing industrial locations, deregulated power zones. But what I would like to do is see if next time we meet, we could have some testimony on the effects of SF 159. It's been 3 years now since that was passed, and there appears to be some bumps in the road that we might be interested in addressing. So there were some people here yesterday that we could invite to give testimony from an industry perspective, what some of the problems they may be encountering as they work through SF 159. But I would like to have that testimony for this committee if that's possible, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. Your able staff put that together. Yeah, yes,
Mr.
Representative.
Chairman, I'd like to
Gray.
add, I think that folds really well into the deregulated power zone conversation because, I mean, you get deregulated power zones and you could have a coal-fired power plant that is sold that supplies those electrons, so.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Anyone else?
I'm done, Mr.
Anything else to come before for the good of the body? No? We're adjourned then. 3 o'clock.
What is it?